I'd like to welcome you and thank you all for coming. My name is Corinne May-Chahal. I'm Professor of Applied Social Science at Lancaster and also an Associate Director of Security Lancaster. I'm a social scientist and I have a kind of wide-ranging interest in this topic. And we have a very wide-ranging audience, so it's great to see so many people from different backgrounds here. We have people from academia, we have people who are from government and the media, and also from large and small companies. And we're also joined by people who are still at Lancaster and didn't make the whole trip down. And it's being live streamed into Lancaster University, so that's quite exciting too. I'm delighted that we're joined today by a very distinguished panel of experts to hear about this subject, which is increasingly relevant, controversial, and far-reaching: digital privacy. Lancaster University has a long history of providing world-class research and training on issues relating to safety and security in UK society and internationally. Currently, our activities deliver groundbreaking research and postgraduate training through programs as diverse as an MA in conflict development and security and an MSc in cybersecurity. We work with doctoral training centres across the region, actively researching security-related areas. And we have, Security Lancaster was amongst one of the first to be awarded Centre of Excellence status as a cybersecurity research centre. So it's a really exciting place to be. And the success of this activity has led the university to establish our centre, and it integrates so many different disciplines, which makes it really exciting. Behavioural sciences, management, social sciences, technological research, to address contemporary issues relating to the security of individuals, organisations and society. We position ourselves as a hub of excellence that delivers useful research. We want it to work, we want it to mean something, and to disseminate knowledge, and we do that in lots of different ways. Today, we've brought together a panel of experts to explore digital privacy, a pertinent issue which has made countless headlines in recent months. The internet is full of our data. It allows for better user experiences than ever thought possible and allows businesses and services to understand our preferences, experiences, and desires. Has this also come at a cost? Has the privacy of what we do and who we interact with been lost? Do we have the right balance between privacy and security? Do commercial and economic forces drive our model? And most relevantly at the moment, do crime and state security priorities alter the balance of what we must expect? These are the kind of issues that we aim to debate this evening. I'm very pleased to introduce Lieutenant General Professor Sir Edmund Burton, who will be chairing today's event as we explore all these questions. Sir Edmund, I asked him before this event about two things that he might like us to know about him. And he very kindly gave me two things. The first is that he spent 25 years addressing the implications of interactions in a fast-moving and uncertain world in terms of the implications of information. And the second was that he views people as being at the heart of technology and communications, and he puts people at the centre as the principal asset in that relationship. Joining Sir Edmund on the panel are Professor Awais Rashid, who is Director of Security Lancaster, Professor Nick Coleman, who became Honorary Professor at Lancaster University in June 2014, Dr. Mike Short, Vice President of Public Affairs at Telefonica Europe, and myself. We'll be taking questions via Twitter, hashtag Security Lancaster, as well as questions from the floor. And now I'd like to hand over to Sir Edmund. Thank you.
Corinne, thank you. Now would be a good time to switch your mobile devices to stun or silent mode, whatever that happens to be. So, Corinne, thank you, and welcome to all of you, whether you're present in person here in the BMA House in London or elsewhere. Special welcome to our panel. As you've seen from their biographic notes, our panel brings a breadth of professional experience and knowledge, and each will bring a different perspective in this important topic. So I've asked each of them to precede their opening remarks with a brief personal introduction, emphasizing their particular interest in this subject. We're under strict time constraints, so they've been limited to 7 minutes each in order to allow 50 minutes for discussion at the end. And what I hadn't told them is that there is a trapdoor under each seat, and after 7 minutes I shall just pull this lever. We'll close promptly at 7:30, the formal proceedings, and that'll be followed by a networking reception for those here present. You can follow this discussion and contribute through Twitter, in comment, or with questions to the panel, and the Twitter feed will be displayed in the reception area at the back. For those short of memory, can I ask the team, could you put the view file on again? Yes, if you just leave it on, please. So, just to remind, our subject is, in this digital era, do we still have privacy? Did we ever have privacy? The panel's objective, just to reassure you, is to provide an informative, thought-provoking and enjoyable panel discussion as our fitting contribution to the 50th anniversary commemoration of Lancaster University. I thought it'd be a good idea to look up the definition of privacy in the Oxford English Dictionary. I'm sure that's bedside reading for many in this august audience. And it says the following: a state in which one is not observed or disturbed by other people. A state in which one is not observed or disturbed by other people, to which one might add, or organization. And so to our panel. And I'm going to start by asking Professor Rashid on my left to introduce himself and start your stopwatches now.
Thank you, Sir Edmund. I think Corinne has already introduced me, that I head the Security Center at Lancaster University. I should acknowledge that I am a computer scientist by background, but that is a bit of a fallacy in the sense that I have worked at the boundary of computer science, social science, and psychology for many years. So in some ways, I would think of myself as an interdisciplinary researcher. My interest in privacy very much comes from the perspective that the world around us has changed and is continuously changing. There are estimates that by 2020 there will be 35 zettabytes of data around. I remember at the start of the CERN Large Hadron Collider project when I was involved in some of the early discussions of data management, and back then we were talking about petabytes of data storage, and that was a big deal. Okay, now nobody even talks about that. There are also estimates that there will be 50 billion connected devices by 2020. What this means is that we really are living in a hyper-connected world, and it is going to become even more and more connected. So the world around us is changing, but how do we manage privacy? And the ways in which we manage privacy, are they actually remaining in step with this complexity and connectivity that is emerging everywhere. Now, let's not forget, privacy is hard. Okay? It's not an easy problem. And given the openness of the various systems through which we share our data or into which we contribute our data, it is actually very, very complex. It's also a very personal thing. What I would think of as private, my colleagues on the panel may not think so, or you may not think so. It's also very, very contextual. In certain contexts, we are willing to give up more of our privacy because there is some gain, not necessarily a monetary gain or a service that we may be able to receive. It just provides us with some immediate gain. For example, disclosing our location may make it easy for us to find our way to a particular destination. However, I think part of the problem is that the world around us is changing, but the way we manage and perceive privacy isn't actually changing in step with it. How do we treat privacy? We normally treat it as an issue of compliance with regulatory codes. There are regulatory codes out there, and organizations are required to comply with those codes. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that regulation doesn't have a role to play. However, regulation of this kind, by default, goes to the lowest common denominator. It can only regulate for the very basic things. And the net result of that tends to be is that all the focus on privacy tends to be at the point of data sharing, where you are first sharing your data and what I would call the first hop of your data. However, anecdotal evidence, of course, suggests that once you get to the third hop, you're effectively in the badlands, okay? And practices start to deteriorate into how organizations or those entities comply with that kind of regulation. So I think this is where the challenge lies. We tend to take a very shallow view of privacy. We need to think about privacy in more deep ways. And part of this shallow view comes from the fact that we think of it in terms of controlling access to certain pieces of information. And yes, it's important to control access to my personally identifiable information. However, that is not the only information about me out there. There can be a lot of inference made about my activities using various pieces of information that I actually contribute online through different social media, for instance. Okay? So what we need is actually a deeper view of privacy. And that deeper view of privacy is important because let's say you're sitting in an internet cafe or in a cafe, you're using your mobile device, you're using it, using some cloud services on that mobile device, and using it to access all sorts of personal data. And your data at this particular point in time, behind the scenes, is crossing a lot of different boundaries. It goes from the cafe's network to some other network, through to a social media provider, through to a cloud provider. And as a user, it's a very, very complex landscape in which your data lives. And how do you manage your privacy in those settings is really complicated. And it's not simply a matter of compliance. Because often breaches of those compliance only get detected post hoc. And yes, once they are detected, how do you actually make sure that this complex landscape, where you cannot even predict what kind of services you might use, might actually enforce those regulations? And of course, the internet is not only a place where people do only positive things. If there are people who are intent on breaching access to data or gaining access to your data, then in case of untrusted parties, in that landscape, it makes things even more complicated. I want to end by basically suggesting that in my view, the whole concept of privacy management is perhaps flawed. Because privacy is a complex problem. We cannot simply treat it as a problem of managing access to data. In fact, what is required is a shift towards user empowerment. So a couple of years ago, we did a study of the 16 main or the 16 biggest social networking platforms around the world, simply trying to test if what they say in their privacy policies can actually be translated onto the controls that they provide to their users. And we found that in almost 50% of the cases, there were total mismatches. Okay. This is not just a problem of privacy policies providing legalese. It's a problem whereby, as a user, you cannot translate what you are promised to what you actually receive. One of the interesting examples I heard on the radio last week or a couple of weeks ago, where somebody was saying how wonderful the cloud was, and they accidentally ended up deleting their data. And they were completely horrified. However, they contacted the cloud provider in San Francisco, and they could actually retrieve their data. That's a great thing, but equally, that made me wonder, as a user, how do we actually ever receive a guarantee that our information is removed when we remove it? So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Awais. Now turning to my right to Professor Mike Short, Vice President, Public Affairs, Telefonica Europe. Mike.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to Lancaster for inviting me here tonight. Because I'm a VP of Telefonica, maybe I should just say a few brief words about Telefonica, because this is a very important subject to us, not just the company, but the customers we serve. We serve over 24 million customers in the UK and over 320 million customers around the world in 24 countries. And our customers' privacy is absolutely vital to the service that they need, but also to the service we wish to offer. So we're licensed as operators in 24 countries, and we make sure that that privacy is protected. Notwithstanding that, what we see today is a world where more than 7.5 billion customers around the world will be using mobile devices, and an ever-increasing number will be using the mobile internet. That is opening up huge markets around the world where data is the new currency. And last year we published, with the support of European Voice, data, the new digital currency, because we can see data is a form of currency when we use it to exchange information, to help get personalized services back to us, but also to deliver new services that may be paid for or supported by advertising. A few examples. In retail, the internet couldn't actually survive without some of the internet e-commerce delivery mechanisms, without the identity being shared with companies like Amazon or the various app stores. So in retail, the digital economy is already with us, but identity is critical to that. Again, those retailers need to protect your identity in the same way as we try and protect your identity. In entertainment, the move towards streaming video or streaming music is already growing very fast, and it's absolutely critical that identity is part of that to make sure you get what you want, not what you don't want. It's also critical in the sports arena, where you might want your side to have delivered results rather than somebody else's side. Let's say Manchester United versus Arsenal. In transport, we're doing some work on connected cars, where we're starting to connect cars so that they know where the nearest petrol station is, where they can get real-time maps, where they can get evidence to tell them where there are hotels or restaurants available. The transport for connected cars also will extend into connected rail, where you get more service-driven type activities. But location is a key part of that, and location is a key subject for privacy from our point of view. However, it may help the productivity in the case of rail in delivering the right number of sandwiches to the right train before it leaves. It might also be able to alert you in the event that you have a delay to alternative transport arrangements. So having information related to transport is critical in a connected rail sense. And two final sectors to mention. Energy, we're connecting 2/3 of UK homes with smart meters in the coming 5 years or so to help with energy management in the home. And we're not doing the whole system, but we're providing the connectivity to the meter. And as such, that's very important to help manage the home. But the smart home of the future will allow you to have a more informed home where you know the various things that are working well or not working well, whether it's through energy management or lighting management or perhaps maintenance management. And last but not least, healthcare. We're seeing a lot more interest in the transfer of data for healthcare, where assisted living may help people to live at home longer, where assisted living may mean that people can be released from hospital more quickly. Data is the key ingredient to all of these sectors and those new markets. And to conclude, Ofcom said last July that we are spending more time communicating than sleeping. That may shock some people who need a lot of sleep, but this is the various forms of communication available to us today give us more choice than ever before. And we've realised that that means that we have a particular role. We issued last year a separate report called a Digital Manifesto, the likes of which are available for a free download of www.digitalmanifesto.telefonica.com, Telefonica being the parent company. And in that area, we've addressed some of the key concerns to do with privacy, whether it be to do with cybersecurity or protecting children and some of the key issues in that area. And I'll be very happy to take questions on those subjects later. Thank you very much.
Mike, thank you. That was commendably concise. I now turn to my further left and Professor Nick Coleman, Global Head of Cybersecurity Intelligence, IBM, but importantly the founding CEO of the Institute of Information Security Professionals.
Thank you. Good evening. Tonight, just to be clear, I'll be making personal comments, so this is not, I'm not speaking on behalf of any organisation, this is my personal view. Let me start by talking about the context I bring to this. So in the last few years, as we've just touched on, cyber attacks have been growing significantly. It started with significant retail attacks, it's been significant in banking attacks. We've now seen this year a ramp up of healthcare and a number of healthcare organisations being attacked, as well as news media sites and a number of things. There is a variety of motives for different cyber attacks. As you're probably aware, companies like Sony have been in the media for some of their attacks and some of the implications of it. The thing which I'd like to draw out from the context of some of those cyber attacks is what comes back to it is some of that data and where people are trying to exploit data and for what reasons. So when we talk about privacy, we also perhaps talk about protecting data and why we need to protect data. And what does that data control? So let me just give you a couple of examples of some of the cyber attacks. Some of the news media organizations have been attacked so that they can get email addresses from some of the subscribers and account information. Why is that helpful? Sometimes it's helpful to try and use those email addresses to then use those to come and actually email you a fraudulent, suspicious link, which you then click on, which then causes further damage. So actually it's a harvesting. You may think that your email address is not very sensitive. It may be out there. Some of you may not wish your email address to be out there. But one has to start with this discussion about what's valuable and where does it start to. Where does sharing it help and where does actually not, and having that effectively parameters which say, I prefer my information to be protected to a next level. Let me take one further step in this journey. As we start to look at some of the attacks, some of that information, what I would call biographical information, your name, your address, your email, some of it may again be visible in other contexts. As we're in a healthcare society tonight, I think it would be interesting just to think about for a moment, and it's some work I've done when I was in government. I was previously the National Review of Security for the UK government. We looked at, for example, what you did when your name and address are there, but when you start to combine that, for example, with a blood group, suddenly the context changes significantly. So when we look at data, let's start to think about what data it is, what's value in that data, and also the contextual relationship of adding more fields may change that data significantly. Then let's think about our lives and how they've evolved. So tonight, I actually managed to find a paper map, Book of London, to see if one could still find these things, to see if one, and most people would think that was absolutely ridiculous to come with a paper map, and someone asked me, what year was it published? It's quite old. It is available on CD, which I didn't want to carry around with me either, to try and find the venue. Well, it was great, except that it took me quite a long time, much longer than it would taking a phone. So actually, do we have a trade-off between actually saying, well, for an efficiency, for a convenience, we might like to impart some data to get an efficiency of service? And you could think about putting your destination in a map. Is that sensitive? Some of you may choose that actually is very sensitive and you don't want to engage in digital connectivity, and others may view it different. So we view it differently. I take two other examples just to extend this analogy. One about TVs. So increasingly TVs are digitized and instrumented and have the ability to be voice activated. As some of you may have seen in the newspapers, there's been quite a lot of coverage as to whether the TV is recording all your conversations you have in front of it, not just the ones you speak to the TV. Again, what's our requirement? How does that work? And then my third example, just to kick off this discussion, is really, let's talk about drones. So I'm not sure a drone flying above my bedroom window is going to be particularly attractive. So in that context, depends on who's operating the drone, depends on what it's being used for. On the other hand, there is an innovation which is starting to take hold about sea rescue, where a drone can fly out faster than a lifeguard and could potentially save your life if you're drowning close to the sea. So in that context, we might be willing to sacrifice a bit of privacy of filming people over a beach if actually that's going to save someone's life. So part of this for me is about our individual preferences. Part of it is about the organisations we engage in and how we've worked with, in other words, our service providers, be that banks, be that utilities, be that all kinds of organisations we come to. And the third thing is the legal framework. And we have to look at those three things, for me, within the context of some people trying to do cyber attacks to exploit our information and what we really want as outcomes for our society and the outcomes we want for our trade-offs and our ability to live the lives that we want. Not all of us are the same, so we have to have frameworks, legal and otherwise, which allow us to navigate our personal preferences within the ability to either choose to do the mobile phone, or for those of you who want to look at the book afterwards, it's quite lengthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now turning back to Corinne, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so lots of interesting questions there. I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective. Much of my research has involved children and safeguarding, so I'm kind of looking at this from a children and young person's perspective. And quite essentially, children's rights are clearly specified in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and one of those is the right to privacy. And yet, in a way, children are probably under more surveillance than many adults. So there's a paradox, and I think really what I want to put forward are some of the paradoxes of privacy. I began my research many years ago looking at the disclosure of child sexual abuse, and at that point I came across some work by a sociologist called Harvey Sachs, which was entitled "Everyone Has to Lie." And what he was trying to get to was the idea that if I say to you, "Hello, how are you?" You've got something in your mind, I'm sure. I won't ask you to repeat it. But most of us will say, "Fine, thank you, good, whatever." And we basically retain a lot of information. We don't impart everything. And anyway, actually, it's not possible to impart everything because we would be going on forever. So there's a point about retention and control of information, which then starts to point to how the ways in which we transact that information is socially organised. So there's an order to the kinds of telling and disclosure of information, a social organisation to that information, which we control through things like confidentiality and privacy. So children, for example, might tell a helpline about things that are happening to them in confidence, but they do that because they don't or aren't able to tell those closest to them, and it's easier to do anonymously and to a helpline. So there's lots of interesting things that happen in the disclosure of information, sensitive information. Recently, I did a project with the Wades, and we went into schools and asked children about how they decided who they were talking to online. And we set up this experiment where children were sort of talking, chatting, and they were disclosing all sorts of personal information about which their teachers had no idea and were really shocked. And they really didn't know who they were talking to, although they sort of thought they did, but weren't entirely sure. And I think what was interesting to us was the way in which they were so keen to engage in that environment and impart as much information as they wanted to without too much reserve. So I think what we do, I suppose I answered the exam question, which is, in the digital era, do we still have privacy? And I think what I would like to say is that the digital world still enables privacy, but it disrupts the social organisation of privacy in quite important ways, and ways that I don't think we fully understand and certainly haven't properly got to the bottom of. So is it that children just don't mind? Is it that they're naive? Is it a lack of know-how? Or is it that they manage in different ways? And if we look at the research, some of the research around that, we see that actually it's something to do with where it matters. So also in that same study, we had a girl who was very upset at some information that was disclosed, and she thought it was about her personally. So when it's about strangers or people that are somehow distant, that seems to be okay for children and young people, but if it's going to affect you personally, then it's something that is important and has consequences. We find that actually on Facebook, for example, research done with children and young people on Facebook, that they use something that's referred to often as the mum test. So they're not going to disclose very much that they wouldn't already expect that their parents would know. And the thing about that is that accidents happen. So although children and young people might think that they're managing their privacy in ways that matter to them, actually sometimes that doesn't work, and for all the reasons that we've just been hearing about. So you get then some pretty difficult consequences. There's the classic story of the teenage girl who was pregnant. She changed her shopping habits, and this was noticed, and so she started getting adverts for baby products and things like that, and she hadn't told her parents she was pregnant, and the parents sort of asked her, well, so why are you getting all these adverts for baby products? And so she had to disclose that she was pregnant. So that disrupted the order of telling. She hadn't told her parents yet, but Google was telling them. And this is something which, okay, that probably would have had to have come out at some point. But there are other accidents that happen that can be pretty lethal, and there was a very recent case where a woman was murdered by her partner for not disclosing her Facebook password. And so that's how it kind of starts integrating into private family life. The digital era sort of connects in lots of different ways and cannot be disentangled anymore from our family and private lives. And I suppose the thing is that I don't think children and young people are fully prepared for that disruption of their privacy. So.
Thank you. Well, I commend the panel members for keeping so close to the time limit. Well done. Interestingly, I only detected an answer to the question from Corinne. And I'm just going to quickly ask the panel, in this digital era, do we still have privacy? Nick?
Well, I got sight of the responses of the audience in the anonymous survey, so I think I'll start with that little insight, which I think was, I think we were discussing earlier. Oh, we have the data. Maybe
you're cheating. I'm asking you. I'm going to give the audience the poll in a moment.
Very good. I shall stick to myself. I think the answer is we do. We have legal frameworks, and whether and those are constituted, they are enforced. Whether they are optimised is a different matter. We have people who are chief privacy officers in lots of organisations who have the responsibility. We have terms and conditions which set out a lot of this, although I think a lot of us perhaps are ticking on those terms and conditions without reading them fully or understanding the implications of what we're actually signing up to sometimes. So my answer is yes, we do. Technology is changing, which is giving us new models, but I think fundamentally we have frameworks, we have rules, we have people who are responsible, we have ways of negotiating this. I think our job is to make sure those mechanisms work.
Thank you. Always?
So I think I'm going to give you an academic's answer, which usually starts with "it depends." But I think, to me, the question is slightly different. It's not do we still have privacy, is it should we have privacy? And the answer to that is yes. However, do we understand what privacy means in this digital era, and do we fully understand the implications on privacy? I think the answer is no. And I think that's where, so I'm going to give you the academic's answer, which is a yes and a no. But I think the fundamental issue really here is that we treat privacy by translating it into problems of compliance, problems of creating user interfaces, or problems of creating policies. And what that simply does is it shifts the focus from privacy itself as a concept. And I think that's what we need to bear in mind.
My brief answer is yes, we still have it. However, it is distributed and different to what we grew up with. Distributed in the sense that we might have different notions of privacy and it might be in different places, and it's different to the tradition. To give a few examples, I don't mind my address of my home being online, but I'm not sure that tells everybody everything about me. I don't mind my qualifications being online or in a CV, but I'm not sure it tells you everything about all my interests or about me. I don't mind my height or even my weight being online, but I'm not sure it tells you about my health or my particular medicine, if I have medicine and that sort of thing. I think also the notion of regulating this area is tough, because actually I think children is a special case where I think because children don't understand identity and don't always understand privacy, I think to regulate in that area is tough. But I think when I hear from the European Commission headlines like "the right to be forgotten," and I then think about the impact that could have on education, which is cumulative, or the impact that may have on health, which has to be cumulative for proper treatment, I think there has to be a sharing culture alongside the debate about privacy.
Thank you. That seems pretty fair to me. We've got a yes, however, comma, it depends. We've got a yes, however, and a yes, but. The poll from those who responded to the invitation to this event was 46% yes, 34% no, 20% unsure. But what we're really interested in is how you respond to the thoughts that you've had from the panel. Now, we've got two questions that have been posed and sent by email. Professor Nasebi is one. Yes, could you just stand up so that everybody can see you? And then Professor Sasser has one also to follow on. Over to you.
Good evening,
to the panel.
Good evening, everyone. So thank you for that contribution. I guess I'm an academic as well, and so, or perhaps a politician, and I'd like to rephrase the question because I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the tone of a lot of the debate on privacy, which suggests that somehow we shouldn't have privacy. And I think the obvious answer should be, of course, we have privacy. The question is, how do we achieve it? I think privacy has been demonstrated over the years to be something that socially we tend to move towards, and people do like having privacy, but of course they also want to have some sort of sharing in their lives as well. Too much privacy and you have isolation, and too little privacy you have overcrowding. And so the question really is much more nuanced than a binary question about yes, do we have privacy or don't we? And I think one of the issues, and I will get to my question, which is why is it that when we talk about privacy, we always talk about the negatives? We talk about crime, we talk about protection and difficulties, we talk about abuse, when of course privacy is also, as I think one of the speakers said, is about sharing. And maybe some of the discourse that we have to have is about how do we have informed sharing, how do we achieve sharing, and have it within the context of course, achieving some sort of protection. I wonder if the panel has some comments on that.
Do I have any takers?
I'm happy to go.
Mike, yep.
So I'm all in favour of sharing, and the reason we did a digital manifesto was to open up the debate so that people could see what could come with sharing. We talked about some of the sharing that might lead towards innovation. We talked about some of the sharing where it might be a public decision or a community decision, and we also talked about the role of government. We called it a digital manifesto because actually it was a manifesto for change. In other words, to have some of that debate rather than it being ignored. If we talk specifically about privacy, we put in 3 principles. We think to build digital confidence is a key strand of this manifesto. And we talked about building in transparency and control for digital citizens. So more awareness of what is your data and making sure it's understood how it's dealt with in a transparent way, but also making sure you had more control. So it touches on the right to be forgotten, but with reasonable controls. The second thing is it talks about privacy and identity and a new deal on data. Should you be able to sell your data in exchange for something in return, as opposed to giving it to somebody for purely sharing? But talking about privacy, there are lots of solutions today that can actually help that, whether it's privacy of your condition, your state, or maybe your content. And lastly, we talked in the manifesto about safety and cybersecurity. Safety not just for children, but safety in terms of where data could be kept. That, to me, is a more rounded way about looking at whether sharing is good or bad, but also to enable other things like innovation to move forward.
Thank you. Nick?
So I think we, in a headline world, get caught up with the headline, which says, for example, Bank A has lost 80 million customer records. Isn't this terrible? Maybe due to a cyber attack, maybe due to some inadvertent act within the organization. A whole set of parameters might cause that. And what I think, in answer to your question about sharing and information, certainly I think there's a duty for us to think about the positive side of what we can achieve. For example, in medicine, if a particular person's medical records can be shared with a large population, that has been proven to give you better health outcomes because you're comparing not just with the health sample perhaps of your local doctor, but perhaps with an entire population on a global basis. So there are huge benefits of information sharing, and that's then when we have to get down to, well, what are the principles, what are the parameters, and then what's the architecture which we're going to make it happen with. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about the negative, as you say. I would agree with that, because we're driven to the headline, because that happens to be quite popular. We often don't get reminded of the positive piece, and what we don't have is sometimes, so some organizations are very good at this, where they create effectively programs for privacy inside their organization. They then think about how to test that with their key stakeholders and essentially design privacy into the organization and then deploy it through a whole set of governance and architectures to make it happen. So in answer to your question, I think we first sort of got to step back from the discussion and say, well, what is it, the principles that we want this organization or this environment or this process to have? And then we've got to think about how we actually make that happen.
Thank you.
So I think that's an interesting question, Bashar. And my answer to that is that I think it's a complex issue, because when we say how do we achieve privacy, first of all we have to be empowering users to do that. And the iCloud hack, for example, exposed certain private moments of celebrities and became a big deal. And people were more concerned about the sort of that privacy breach, but nobody actually asked the question as to why it happened in the first instance. And it is because people did not understand that what they were doing on their devices were actually automatically getting backed up onto a cloud server. And I think it's this understanding of how our information flows. And unfortunately, a lot of the systems are by design poorly designed to empower users. I'm not suggesting that it's intentional, but in the participatory data economy in which we live, users' data is important. So it's in fact in the interest of organizations to encourage users to provide data, rather than, perhaps I'll be controversial and say, empower them not to. And I think that's where the fundamental question lies. I think as long as we keep on treating it as a problem that organizations need to manage and provide us with controls to do things, I think we would always be fighting a losing battle. I think when we shift the perspective and say we need to have mechanisms to empower users, that's where we will start to see some gains. And then we can make informed choices about what we want to share, how we want to share it, and how far it gets shared as well.
Can I just disagree with that a little bit?
Go on, fight.
I think that there's sometimes when you don't know. So actually, in that medical context, I'm not sure I, as the empowered patient, will have the best view of whether actually in a medical system that information needs to be shared. But if the doctor and the medical system can explain the parameters and the principles they apply and how my data gets protected, I'm comfortable. What I guess is, in some cases, even empowering the user, you have to look at that in the context of somebody else in that system may have actually better information.
So am I allowed to disagree now? So you are right in that sense, Nick. However, we all received those letters from the NHS when they decided that information would be shared across NHS trusts. And I'm afraid, I don't know how many people in the room actually understood what was going to happen. I'm not embarrassed to admit, I had no clue after reading that letter and reading tons of information online what was going to happen. Okay, so I did what everybody else probably did, erred on the side of caution, worried that if I were having a heart attack, I might not be able to be treated. I actually said yes. And I think that's where the problem lies. Because on the one hand, this is meant to empower me, yet I felt when signing that thing totally disempowered.
Yeah,
because I was kind of forced into doing that. I do not disagree that there is great value to be derived. There are online communities, for example, Patient Like Me, where users actually share information, and it provides great support infrastructure for conditions where you would actually not find people within your vicinity to go and talk to. So I think I agree there is loads of value, but I think at the moment, the way we do it, actually instead of empowering the users, disempowers them.
Right, taking the baton from my left. Just before I give Corinne a chance to chip in on this, we just had two thoughts from the outstations, one from Howard Skidmore. If we share our information for a specific reason, and this is expanded, do we have grounds to complain? I think that's rhetorical. And from Alistair McCapra from Google Search, if providers start to require a rights waiver on your data as a condition of sign-up, is there any point worrying? Can you splice that into the discussion that was...
Just say that last one again.
If providers start to require a rights waiver on your data as a condition of sign-up, is there any point in worrying? There is a sort of link with conversation.
Well, there is, yes. And it actually doesn't quite relate to the point I was going to make, which was quite a quick one. But the fact that actually we keep talking about we, and we is, I think in this kind of digital world, we still have a lot of the social divisions that we have in the sort of offline world. And this one in particular, I really like this question because it was a really interesting idea, having informed sharing, but access to the informed bit is not equally distributed. So how do we manage that, as well as how do we get to the kind of more practical bits about actually building a process for doing informed sharing, and is it a good thing? Does everyone have the same right to that informed sharing? And to make that point again about age, there are differences in age, there are differences in knowledge, differences in access, but also gender. I mean, gender is a huge issue in this field and hardly ever gets discussed, but there are very different issues going on in terms of these different social divisions. So, I mean, you know, we're doing a project at the moment on trafficking. It's the traffickers that remain anonymous, largely male. It's the women and children who are the ones who end up, you know, being exposed, as it were. So, I don't quite get to the rights waiver in there, but people are doing that now, aren't they? So, do we or not? At the moment, it's a personal choice.
We may pick that point up again in discussion. Thank you for that exchange. I'm now going to ask Professor Sasser to give us her question.
So
So not all organizations, commercial organizations and service providers are as enlightened and have a policy like the one that Mike Short has described. To come back to the question about the search, do I basically have to sign away all my rights when I sign up for a service? And I think that's sort of part of, that is really the kind of situation that upsets individual users today, right? That you don't have a genuine choice. Either you provide your data, and if you don't provide your data, you don't get the service. And then you've once you've given permission, legally, service providers certainly seem to feel they have the right to use that data in any way they feel fit. You're basically writing them a blank check, and then you have no comeback. Mm-hmm. So my question to the panel would actually be: is at the moment that there seems to be, very little that people can do. They're put in this situation, my way or the highway. And then I can use it in any way I like. So, for instance, even if you told me you don't want to be tracked, if I see a good business opportunity there, or somebody pays for me to track you and then push an advert to you, to entice you to spend money when you're just trying to, be more financially responsible, sort of entice you to come back to a gambling site when you're just trying to stay off it or something like that. So it's really people object to not necessarily the data being seen or being used by somebody. It's the consequences of that they care about. I get the impression that some service providers think, it doesn't really matter, people, even if you upset people and you do things to them they don't agree with, ultimately they will just go along with it and eventually forget about it. So do you think there is any mileage in pushing for a digital charter? Do the users of the services maybe have to, individually there's of course nothing you can do, but should there be collective action? Should there be a union of Facebook users that basically pushes back and negotiates with the service provider? If the government shares data in a way we don't agree with, or uses that data in a way that citizens don't agree with, is there a case for civil disobedience being organized?
Mike.
So first of all, I think there is a strong case for organisation and a manifesto. For organisation, because I think it gives clarity to a range of players and stands above competition. Clearly, I know there are a difference between regulated service providers and unregulated service providers, but I don't think this is a matter for a new ICO or a new consumer protection registrar. What I think can be done in the digital world is much more of a crowd-based approach or a community-based approach, and I think a manifesto could sit well with that. But just to take your point about tracking, I think there are some real benefits in tracking that are often not communicated. So one of the key points in any manifesto to me is the benefits have got to be clear up front to the customer. If you're going to give data, what are you giving it for? And in the tracking case, we certainly track some people who might be suffering from Alzheimer's disease. It makes sense to help protect that person if they stray beyond a geofence, a geographic boundary. It also makes sense to track cars if it minimises theft and allows the police to find where that car is. It also perhaps makes sense in some insurance areas to have some forms of tracking, because you can give a policy to a young driver, but that young driver can only drive at certain times of day or maybe in certain locations. So tracking has some benefits, but the benefits have got to be communicated before you get into, dare I say it, heavy-handed regulation or traditional regulation. That, to me, is a set of examples of tracking benefits which aren't always communicated well and need to be communicated better.
What about the notion of a user's charter and perhaps collective action if there was no response? Do you have a view on that?
I think the question would be, how do you devise a user charter? It's quite interesting that the Magna Carta is nearly 800 years old. Do we need a digital Magna Carta, which talks about things where some ideas are crowdsourced and discussed to say, here's the original Magna Carta, what would you change in this digital world, and then get input. How you finalise it, I don't know. It might have to be a living digital Magna Carta, but it would certainly address user rights in the same way as it might address human rights, it might address some other rights that would be in a digital Magna Carta.
An interesting thought. Corinne?
Yes, I mean, I agree with the crowdsourcing idea, and I'm sort of reminded of the kind of birth of the internet, as it were, and the hopes for the internet and all this activity, and somehow it seems to get diverted over time, and so we can crowdsource, we can organise, but then it fractures, and all sorts of other things take over for lots of different reasons. I was just going to mention that, I've already mentioned the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also there's the Human Rights Act. And, I mean, we have Article 8, which governments really should, and all governments have a responsibility to protect our right to privacy. Every 5 years, the government has to report to the UN about its progress on rights. And if you look at the privacy bit, certainly for the Children's Convention on the Rights of the Child, it hardly touches the surface of what governments ought to be doing in terms of protecting rights to privacy. So absolutely, I'm all for, sort of social organisation in those kinds of ways, but I think we also need to be getting a bit more buy-in from governments in terms of what they're doing.
To you on my left.
I think I will give a very short answer to Angela's question. I think the answer has to be yes. In all sorts of interesting ways, but I think the answer has to be yes, because we have to get away from this notion whereby privacy or providing privacy is an organization's responsibility. It's a problem that people face on a regular basis, and I completely agree with you. This notion of an all or nothing, an opt-in and you get all this stuff, and opt-out and you don't. And one of the interesting things that we did in a small student project a few years ago was whereby when you get a mobile phone app, you have to then sign up what information you gave. And we did some analysis, and in fact, a lot of the apps actually did not require all that information to operate. But they still required all those rights. And we came up with this really simple thing whereby you could actually lie. Okay, you could give fake information because that was not important for the operation of the application. So you actually made an informed choice. Unfortunately, under the terms and conditions, you had to lie to do that. Sorry, Nick.
So I think that I kind of think of a digital Magna Carta as a very interesting concept. I sort of wonder, is it this year, or was it meant to be in 10 years' time, and when's the optimal point to start, and have we started too late? The questions for me come back to, and we touched on it a little bit on rights and some of those big categories. For me, it's about getting the framework right. And the framework within that may be within a society, that may be within an organization, which kind of sets the principles and the parameters I mean, there may be much better language, but in the privacy world, that sort of translates to things like privacy impact assessments that lots of organizations, I recommended that to the government and they adopted it for government programs. So in government, privacy impact assessments are now rolled out quite widespread. So there are mechanisms by which we can start to get some of those things involved. I think it's, we have to sort of think down to the practicality as well. If we're too specific, like, for example, asking you permission every 5 minutes, users say, well, actually, I don't want that. I don't want to be asked every 5 minutes. I'd like to be asked once, thank you very much. And so we have this practicality of operation that then, once you've got the framework, sort of this, I'm now going to call it a digital Magna Carta, and then you apply that, then you have to think, well, how does that really work in practice? And to some extent, you have to have governance mechanisms in communities, in organizations, in the ways that you come together, which then allow you to actually deploy that effectively. I think the other thing, just when I look at my car, when I look at, some of the services I interrelate to, if I had that framework which tells me what the principles my car is going to operate by and where the data is going to be shared with and the parameters that it's going to operate, and if it crosses that threshold, they're going to come back, that might be helpful. At the moment, to some extent, I have really no idea what my car is doing, and I accept it because it doesn't have at the moment consequences that are negative for me. I haven't seen those. I've seen it in the repair garage, it being automated, all that kind of instrumentation, very helpful. But as soon as it starts to drive itself, as soon as it starts to communicate with other people, potentially law enforcement, about certain things, potentially about my insurance and how that premium, I'd like to understand those parameters and those principles. So I think the digital magic part are great. Translate that into parameters and principles we understand, and then allow those to be governed and executed so that we get the communication and the execution.
There's some interesting themes emerging here, and I think it behoves us to consider what would be comprised in developing a community of intelligent users and customers. I think many or most of us are ignorant to a degree on what's actually happening to all our information, and the term was, I think this is yours, Awais, understanding information flows. It's only if individuals understand what it is they genuinely own and what's owned by others and how it's used that we can be an intelligent community of users playing a part in this dialogue with private sector providers of services. But it's open now to the floor for some crisp, concise questions. Can I ask you? Yes, gentleman over at the back on the right, if you can wait for the microphone. Please stand up and introduce yourself. Your question.
Good evening. My question is, in this context where the attribution is so emphatic, but there is no logical conclusion to it, where such things like X key store already exist and we know about it. My point is that beyond this academic discussion, how relevant is privacy now in the background that so many intelligence agencies have various ways to accede to what we know? It's fine, you know my name, my address, everything, but not the content of my email. That is where the threshold lies. And my second part of the question is, do we really have a choice? And third part is there any need to change the internet architecture, or can that be done now?
Do you want to have a go at that, Corinne?
Oh gosh, no, not I think it's, well, start with the technical side.
I can start if that's okay. I think that's an interesting question, and
Yeah.
it reminded me of a conversation that I was having with my colleague Dan Prince, who is sitting in the back. And he showed me an article just as we arrived, where this chap has actually voluntarily put all his life online, and for the life of me, I can't remember the chap's name now, and I'm sure Dan will chastise me
Chris
for not.
Dancy.
Sorry?
Chris Dancy.
No, it's a different. So this chap, he put his life online because he was arrested wrongfully on suspicion of engaging in terrorist activities by the FBI, and in the following 6 months, he chose to actually email them his whereabouts all the time. He started to put it online. And on the one hand, you might think that he was forced to do that. On the other hand, he tells the story by saying it was actually in his interest so that they didn't bother him anymore. Okay. So I don't know where the line is, but I think it's an interesting problem. That on the one hand, he shouldn't feel compelled to share all his information with the police in this case. But on the other hand, he actually chose to, and it made his life easier from his perspective. I think as regards the architecture of the internet was designed as a decentralized system. And it would perhaps surprise some of the people in the audience to know that it's actually still run by a lot of volunteers, a lot of kind of, effectively informal agreements and some principles that were put in place very early on. And I think that's the strength of the internet. And I think if we drastically changed its architecture, we actually might be giving up a lot of the fundamentals that may help us on our way to privacy rather than help actually enforce privacy. So I'm going to stop there and maybe see if Nick wants to come in or...
Nick, you can pick that up.
I think I'll pick up do we have a choice? I think we've touched on it a little bit. I mean, the answer is we live in societies which are regulated, critical services are regulated, so our banking industry, as an example, is regulated. Our electricity and infrastructure, critical infrastructure is regulated. So do we have a choice? Well, I think we have a choice as citizens to ask our politicians what we want, and then that sets the legal context of what we want both governments to do, but also where they want to regulate, for example, critical industries. That seems to make sense. There is, as some of you may be aware, a draft piece of legislation on the table at the moment across Europe on cybersecurity called the Network and Information Security Directive, which is sort of another dimension that's more on the cyber stuff. There is also stuff going on in data protection about what those legal frameworks should be. There's also a lot of opportunity really for people to engage and have those discussions with their politicians about what they think are the right appropriate answers. So I think, do we have a choice about the frameworks that we operate? I'd say yes. Do we, coming to Awesh's point a little bit about the infrastructure, well, what we've certainly seen in terms of the infrastructure is that there have been a number of organizations which have experienced digital attack, call them cyber attack, call them what you may. And the question has come down to how good the security is, how good that information is protected, how well the organization maintains its security. And sometimes it's not just about the technology and whether it's patched and all those kind of technical things, but also the processes by which, for example, someone leaving the organization, whether their passwords really get deleted the day they leave, or whether it's a month later, or whether, frankly, we're going to do that IT maintenance 6 months later. Those are the things, which make a difference. And when I ask people, so, when you get an update on your computer, do you always update it? People look at me and go, immediately? No, we leave it for later. So we have to talk about the infrastructure and maintaining its resilience. We have to talk about the legal frameworks we want. But we also have to bring this down to a practicality, which says that there are a number of risks out there. And when designing a system and looking at it, you have to take those risks into account. And there are appropriate available mechanisms by which, for example, in the cyber attack world, we help people now automate their response to move that to a more resilient level. So I think we do have a choice. It's a question of priorities, it's a question of frameworks, it's a question of bringing a society together through the different instruments.
I want to move on, but Mike, do you want to quick?
Just very briefly, as I'm the only service provider present, I would just like to say we only give out customer data with 4 factors in mind. Under warrant, so the police need it to help make an arrest. So the warrant is key. Secondly, we only give out data if it's legal to do so. Clearly, data protection in this country stops us giving out any other data unless there's a warrant. If we give out any other data, though, there are 2 other principles. It's got to be aggregated. So why would you aggregate data? Somebody might need to know how many people are going to a shopping mall on a Monday morning as opposed to a Tuesday morning. So we may give out aggregated data, but the cardinal rule is it's always anonymized. We don't give out names and addresses, we just do not do that. Now, clearly, when it comes to credit checking, there are mechanisms where aggregated and personalized data have to be exchanged, but that's not giving out data to anybody other than people who've signed up to something. The idea of changing the internet for the purposes of Snowden, I think, is ridiculous. It's a decentralized architecture. I'm not sure why we need to do any more. And the idea of reading people's emails is about as daft as reading everybody's text message. It's almost impossible to do that because of the volume. So, under warrant, we might help in some areas.
I'm not an academic. I'm a practitioner. And so if you don't mind, my question will be quite short. And it follows slightly from the last question. I spent 25 years as a privacy practitioner, some 15 looking carefully at the law enforcement community and the needs they have. And my question is quite short and quite straightforward. It's a what question. What aspects of our online lives should be truly private, forever hidden to internet service providers and even to the intelligence agencies?
Thank you, Martin.
So,
Corinne.
Okay, so I'll kick off from my pretty weird perspective. But, one of the points that I was trying to make earlier was that privacy is co-produced. It's not a sort of single standalone social object. So and it's what I would refer to as indexical. It depends very much on its situated context for us to know what is private and what isn't. Anything can be made private, any information can be made private. It depends on the transaction and the social relationships at that time and in that space. So what is a very difficult question because it depends. It's different for different people, different situations in different sorts of contexts. And I don't think you can. I mean, there's lots of sort of statements about legislating for this, legislating for that. I don't think you can unless you actually accept that quality of indexicality.
Very quick, please.
It's very brief. It's what they don't need to know.
I want to quicken the pace slightly. We've had some questions come in which aren't far from the themes we've been addressing. This one's from Sai Full. Do we really know how private our data is? Juice Noppen, how is the discussion affected by globalization? Can it be considered in isolation on a national level? So I'm going to turn to my left and just ask for a quick 2-sentence, 3-sentence response on each of those. Globalization or national or both, do we understand how private our data is?
I think I'm going to tackle the one, do we understand how private our data is? And I think the simple answer is, in most cases, no. And the reason is I used to play a little game with my students. I would, so it was not a huge class, about 50 students. And before the first lecture, I would actually go and look them up on Facebook. And usually I would find about 30 to 40 whose profiles were public on Facebook. And I would walk into the class and I would go, so I looked you up last night on Facebook. I didn't look at anything else for what they knew. How many of you would be happy for me to put up your Facebook profile now on the projector screen? And there were always just a couple who would raise their hands and say, slightly shakily, I dare you. And that was really surprising because there was all this data for everybody to see. But they weren't sure what was there. And in that context, in the context of the class, all of a sudden, they weren't sure what was visible and what was not. And I think if in a class of 50 people, we don't really know, how can we imagine in 1 billion users on Facebook, for example, who is it visible to and how?
And the globalization or national point, is this something that we have got to engage internationally with, or should it be considered in isolation in the first instance nationally? Your internet, you have an international footprint as a company, Mike. Would you like to pick that up? Then Nick. Okay.
So not all customers use services internationally. Therefore, our policies are as international as they can be. But what we don't want to do is to import the worst of one country and the best of one country inappropriately. So therefore, the policies I think we would tend to work to are European policies rather than just UK. We think European policies are very important for consistency of the supply chain as well as consistency of the service. We're less convinced that there is a mechanism for a kind of global policy right now. We do think there is a strong case for an EU-USA axis because of the significance of the internet players in the USA. But in practice, some of those discussions between the EU and the USA tend to descend into different legal philosophies and different trade issues. So there's a lot more work to be done to get something which is, dare I say it, transatlantic, embracing both the EU and the USA. In areas like security, that works pretty well, despite Snowden. In other areas, it needs more work.
Nick, quickly, please.
I think 2 points. One is coming to the data. It's a question of whether you need to know it's me, and when do you need to know it's me. So my browsing habits, did you really need to know it's me? What level of anonymity, and how can you maintain that? And the second bit about the globalization, I think just to add to Mike's point, I think that the question really is about where you're wanting to do the service. So it should be driven and empowered by the community using the service and what they're trying to do. If you're going to try and get on a plane to Australia, then having that European-specific environment of sharing data is probably not terribly helpful to Australians who need to know you're coming, and they need to do background checks. So you have to look at it in the context of the service and get the legal framework to operate within it. Thank you.
Carsten Maple. Where is he? There. Carsten, you have a question. A good question. Well, somebody may be using your name. There is a regulation in a number of sectors. It didn't work too well in banking. Does it work in data privacy? Okay. Sounds like a Nick question.
Nick, then
yeah.
Sorry, can you...
Right, I'll read it slowly. There is regulation in a number of sectors.
Yep.
It didn't work too well in banking. Does it work in data privacy?
Well, the good news is I don't really know a lot about whether the banking regulation was the cause of the financial crash, so I'll leave that to others. I think that the question is whether it's delivering the outcomes. So for me, if you look at the number of cyber attacks, the question is, are you going to get a better environment by placing regulation, and if so, how is that going to be applied? So, for example, do I think, if you try and regulate everything, does that help? I think you have to be rather specific about where it's a critical service. That's where you apply. You get people to focus. You get people within those organizations to really concentrate on what you're trying to protect, what's valuable, and getting the security or the privacy effort really contextualized into what we really want to achieve and the outcome. So I'm not sure I'd sort of look at particular sectors and say they failed. I think if you look at the cyber attacks as one example, they've hit many, many different sectors, some really small companies and some large. There's a rugby club in the northwest of England which got hit with a cyber attack, and they just couldn't understand it. They said, we're tiny. Why did we do it? Well, it got onto Sky News, and perhaps that was part of the unusual behavior. So I'm not sure that the example of the past in that particularly helps. I think that we have to focus on the critical and get people to focus.
Right.
Can I just say something?
Yeah, yes, of course.
Thank you. So this connects a number of things. The first thing is in terms of the social divisions issue that I mentioned earlier, so in terms of regulation, I agree that, less is better, but there are certain sectors of the population that need careful protection. And so I think it's not about the service necessarily. It also ought to be about the users and those who are giving their data. And it was interesting you mentioned dementia earlier, Mike, and I think, there are certain sections of the population that need additional protection, and that regulation ought to apply to that sector. And the other thing, though, is I mentioned the trafficking work we were doing, and Angela Sass's point about consumer protection. The technology side of the trafficking is being addressed largely through social movements, and there's a very interesting approach which David Blair put forward, which is that it takes a social movement to defeat a market, and in that sense regulation isn't terribly helpful. So there are two ways of looking at it.
Yeah, I was responding to the banking regulation question, but I think there is, protecting vulnerable people and different particular things.
We do need regulation in that way, yes.
Right, we have 3 minutes to the witching hour, and I did say I'd finish promptly. I'm going to break my rule and just give a minute to each of our panel members to say what is the thought that you'd like to leave uppermost in the community's minds on this. Corinne, just while you're still in song.
I think I'd like to stress the paradox, really, because there are a group of people who can buy privacy or who have the knowledge to gain privacy in the digital era. And that's either for reasons of state security, or it's for crime, or it's, there are different purposes. And there is a sort of a need for a stronger public voice, and that needs to be publics rather than a public. And we need to be looking at making that more equitable.
Thank you. Wayne?
I'm not a Latin scholar, but I was taught that when buying, always think about caveat emptor, buyer beware. And I think when sharing data, you should take caution with you. I think, though, data is a key enabler for innovation, investment and jobs, so we shouldn't hold back from thinking about those issues or discussing them more fully. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Abet.
I think the one thought that I would like to leave with is that I think we have come to somehow accept the participatory data economy models in which we operate nowadays. We just think that's how it is and that's how it should be. Perhaps we should ask the question, should we think of other ways in which we can still get the benefits of the data, as Mike and others have been highlighting, yet users will have more power, and perhaps we will come up with more interesting models of data sharing and economic models in this world that we live in.
Thank you. Nick?
Today we've been talking a lot about people. In the future, I think we'll be talking about machine-to-machine communication, cars talking to other cars, talking to those kind of environments. So I think this debate is going to broaden and become continually important. I think the takeaway I would leave is it needs three levels. It needs us as individuals to engage and ask the right questions and to continue this debate in our circles and talk about our preferences. It needs the organisations we transact with to be asked those questions and ensure that they have designed those frameworks and those privacy impact assessments and all the machinery that we want in. And then we have to have a societal debate about what the frameworks we want to live in and how that should come to bear. Thank you.
Well, thank you, panel. One of the difficulties in chairing something like this is you become very aware of the questions that are sitting burgeoning amongst the audience, whether they're here or remotely, and knowing that time is totally unforgiving. I suspect that we're looking at a future event of some sort which gives this important topic the time that it deserves, you time to think it through, time to pose the questions and discuss, perhaps more workshopping than this. So let's view this as being an appetizer for a future event. Now, laying on such events takes a great deal of unseen effort, and this is no exception. So I'd like to thank the BMA for allowing us to enjoy and use this superb hall for this. I'd like to thank the university for hosting it. Alex Manzi, I gather, has played a major part in this. She is not here. She is 1 or 2 weeks from the arrival of her first child, and I don't think I'm breaching data protection in revealing that. I did check beforehand. I'd like to thank Becky, Gordon behind me, Rebecca and Angela for their support. And finally, on your behalf, our panel for all their preparation and for their eloquence. Thank you very much indeed.
I attended this lecture because privacy is a really important topic for citizens and consumers today, and because I know Lancaster, colleagues at Lancaster University do really good research on this.
I attended this lecture because privacy is a massive topic of debate right now, and its role in cybersecurity and vice versa is just huge.
I attended this lecture because I wanted to come to a Lancaster alumni event. I'm an ex-Lancaster person, and I think it's a topic of interest and importance for everybody today.
The topic of cybersecurity is vital because more and more of our everyday transactions, of our financial things, everything we do is now online in the digital world. And if that's not properly secured, as more and more of these things have moved online, that's where the value is.
Cybersecurity is vital in this day and age because technology is on the increase. You've got malicious hackers trying to break every systems. You've got governments trying to subvert it for whatever reason. It's just a massive topic of debate right now.
I think everyone is really worried about what happens when they put their information into a computer, where it's going. I frequently have the experience talked about today in the lecture where you're asked, can we ask you all this information? And if you say no, you can't get the service you want. So it's about trying to get some power for individuals, and I was really pleased to see that that's what the panel talked about.
The area of IT that I work in is actually to do with market research and survey research. And in that domain, what is critical is the relationship and the trust that you have with people that you're researching. And so that is all dependent on having very good, firm understanding of data security and anonymization and privacy. It's absolutely what we're dependent on.
The key points I took away from this panel today was that it can't be purely solved through regulation. We need to also think about how consumers can really express their preferences better, and how we can get service providers and government to pay more attention to what consumers and citizens want when it comes to privacy.
I took away from this lecture that privacy nobody really has an answer to. It's something that we're constantly having to readdress, and as technology changes, so will our view on privacy.
The value of the lectures by Lancaster University is that it's these kind of, it's really to start a debate around these topics and get more citizens engaged, and also to get people from different sectors, from academia, from industry, people who work in government and make public policy together and actually talk about this important topic.
The value to me of the free public lectures by Lancaster University, it provides me a fantastic opportunity to network with other like-minded individuals. We've got lots of people from students like myself all the way up to executives in various companies. So just the opportunities to discuss and debate things from all different levels is huge.
It's really what I've found by talking to other people in my industry as well, is that there is so much that we still need to learn about this. There is so much that we actually don't know. So these debates are very good because they're helping us to understand what good practice is, and to understand to explore what the issues are. But there's an awful lot still that we need to understand with this. So I'm encouraged that there's going to be some more discussion about this as well, I hope so.
I think the free public lectures are fantastic. I think it really inspires people to come along and hear experts and have an opportunity to chat with people and just to think about things. It's great.